And now, the story of the man who wanted to change everything and his 12 friends who followed him around the desert. It's Libations and Lectionaries.
Some of the Pharisees from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." And he answered and said, "I tell you that if these shall hold their peace, the stones will cry out."
It's been 1 week since you looked at me, cocked your head to the side and said I'm angry. 5 days since you laughed at me, saying get back together, come back and see me. 3 days since the living room, I realized it's all my fault but couldn't tell you. Yesterday you'd forgiven me, but it'll still be 2 days till I say I'm sorry.
Hello and welcome to Libations and Lectionaries. I'm Reverend Jimmy Gaughan, and I am joined once again by Reverend Katie Calloway. And we're going to skip the whole part about libations tonight because we're both drinking water.
If I have a beer, I might fall asleep.
Yeah. Also, it is late and we are tired. I did have a drink earlier. I had a bourbon old-fashioned made with Buffalo Trace bourbon. Did
Nice.
you have anything earlier on?
I did. I had an Alamut IPA here at Foothills.
Oh, what now?
Alamut. It's their seasonal IPA.
Oh, cool.
From the Craft Happiness Project. I'm reading on the Thursday menu.
All right. Well, I can dig it. I like Foothills IPAs.
It was good.
They always make good ones, in my opinion. We are actually not recording in one of our houses for once. We are recording at Footnote in downtown Winston-Salem. It is a concept, if you will, a cocktail and coffee bar owned by Foothills Brewing Company.
I'm actually really impressed. This is the first time I've been here, and it feels right.
Yeah.
Like, this feels like a place that I would want to come and write a sermon or,
Absolutely.
read something for fun and drink coffee without toddlers trying to steal my coffee.
So
By toddler, I mean one toddler.
yeah, I was going to say, so Sophie's trying to get her coffee fix early on in life, huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
She and Lily together.
The
It's
dog wants
bad.
coffee, too?
Oh, yeah.
I can just imagine a German Shepherd loaded up on coffee. That would be insane.
Yep. She is crazy, and they work together.
Well, that makes sense, because they're only, 4 months apart in age or so?
That would be it. They're like twins, basically.
I could see that being a challenge.
Yep.
So, Katie, since the last episode, I believe you have some pretty freaking big news to share with the audience.
I do. John, my spouse, and I have been called as co-pastors to First Baptist Church, Savannah, Georgia.
Yep. Which means that the next time, well, actually probably not the next time you hear Katie on the podcast, but the time after that will be over Skype again.
Yep, I'll be back on the computer, and but this time there won't be police helicopters, as there were in
that's
Baltimore.
good.
Hopefully.
I mean, you never know. Things can happen.
I don't anticipate that.
There were police helicopters over downtown Durham all day yesterday, and that's
Well,
outside the norm.
Right, but that is also because there was a gas explosion.
Yes. It was a rather unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
One person was killed, 15 injured. The old Studebaker building was completely destroyed. It was not funny, but odd. I do the Full Steam Brewery Run Club on Wednesday afternoons, and they have 3 routes. One is a 3-mile route, which does not go to downtown. The other are a 4 and a 6-mile route, which both do go through downtown. And downtown was closed because they didn't want people going in and out and disrupting cleanup and rescue. So everybody did the 3-mile route. I have never seen it that crowded.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But, I'm glad that people, even as messed up as things in downtown Durham were yesterday, I'm glad that people were still out supporting local businesses because, if you can't just give up when crap happens.
Right.
And it was all around still a very unfortunate situation. It's good that more people weren't badly hurt or killed, but it is very unfortunate that there was one fatality.
Yeah.
That could have probably been avoided.
I live under a rock. What was the cause? Have they identified the cause?
They think that a contractor hit a leaking gas line. So
It's really interesting to me because the different places that I've lived have had very different approaches to gas leaks. When I was in Georgia, there was a gas leak on the other side of town, and it felt like the entire town was evacuated. And I'm being facetious, but there was a gas leak on my street, and all of us had to get out of the street. When I was in Baltimore, there was also a gas leak on my street. Are you sensing a theme? And no one was required to evacuate. The fire department came and shut down our street, but everybody remained in their homes, and people were driving off in their cars that were parked mere feet from the gas leak.
Oh, good times. No sparks there.
Yeah. So I just find it really interesting. I bet that people are going to be a lot more careful from now on.
Sure. Well, and all they really shut down in Durham was just the Brightleaf Square area. Like, if you looked at Google Maps, it was just a mass of closed streets right around that area. But then once you got outside that, like down by DPAC, that was still open. Over by the Durham Bulls Park, that was still open. They just shut down that one little area.
Gotcha.
So
Nice.
But we are not the Gas Leak podcast. We are Libations and Lectionaries.
We're not talking about sports this week, but gas leaks.
That's true. So we are at Footnote tonight because there was just an event that just wrapped up, co-sponsored by the Wake Forest University School of Divinity and the Wake Forest University School of Law, featuring Melissa Rogers, who is visiting faculty at Wake Div and was the executive director of President Barack Obama's partnership.
White House Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships Office.
That's it. Yeah, and we both had her for classes. I had her for Christianity and Public Policy. You had her for Church and State?
I had her. We were in the same class, Christianity and Public Policy.
Just 2 years apart.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what, because they
switched every other year.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's what I was trying to say.
She co-taught that with the late, great Dr. James Dunn, who I feel like, you weren't on the last episode, but on that episode, the story came up of him telling Jerry Falwell that there's nothing in the Bible about a blowjob.
No, that we talked about that when we were sitting at Ted's table. And yes. And that was the moment where I thought, I'm not sharing this with any of my church members.
Well, understandable.
I also learned tonight that he only washed his socks once a week.
Well, I mean, if you have enough socks, you really only need to wash them once a week.
That's true.
And James Dunn was just full of wit and wisdom.
Yes.
But yeah, so tonight was all about religion in the public square.
Right, which is appropriate.
It really is, because that is, to me, the central theme of what we're talking about on this episode, which is Palm Sunday.
Right. So we have Jesus coming down through the back gate of Jerusalem at the same time as government officials come in through the royal gate. And it's quite opposite.
Yes.
Right?
And, he doesn't come in on a chariot or with an annunciation or anything. He comes in on a donkey.
Or a colt.
The colt of a donkey.
Depending on which.
Or, if you will, a donkey and the colt of a donkey.
Right. How does that work out?
Well, he's riding one and towing the other.
Oh, I imagine 1 foot on one and one on the other, and kind of.
What, you mean like the
donkey surfing in
commercial where Jean-Claude Van Damme is doing the splits between two trucks or something?
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't think Jesus was that badass.
Well,
although Son of God, it's
arguable.
Yeah. But to me, the whole point of the donkey and the colt of the donkey was that he was riding the donkey, but you can't separate a colt from its mother that early on.
Ah, okay.
So that was, to me, the entire point of the colt coming along.
I see.
It's like Jesus wasn't an a-hole. He wasn't going to have the disciples borrow the donkey and then just leave its child motherless for a few days or however long.
Yeah. Well, I am no New Testament or Hebrew Bible scholar, but my New Testament class, which was not the official New Testament class of Wake Forest School of Divinity, I had it during the interim. With,
me too. With Uncle Fred.
I remember him talking about, and I could be imagining this, but I'm pretty sure I remember him talking about the colt and the donkey being mentioned in 2 separate prophetic passages, and so one of the gospel writers included both.
Sure.
One included just one, just the colt. One included just the donkey.
Yeah. Well, and let's be real. I mean, Fred Horton was not necessarily my favorite professor, but honest to God, he's forgotten more about the Bible than any of us will ever know.
Right.
So,
right.
So he knew what he was talking about.
Right.
Just in a very discombobulated sort of fashion.
Yes.
So, so it was definitely in the prophecy, and I'm gonna have one of those heretical moments where I say, we don't know for sure that this actually happened, and it might have been a literary choice by the gospel writer to say, here is the fulfillment of prophecy. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that it did, right?
Or maybe it didn't happen exactly as we imagine it to have
Sure.
happened, which I think might be one of the more likely options.
I think very little in the Gospels happened as we imagine it to
Right.
happen. Since the first Gospel that we are aware of was probably written a good 30 years after
Right.
Jesus' time on earth. And everything else just came after that. So, Mark writes it. Mark may have actually seen it firsthand, but separation of 30 years. I mean, 30 years ago, I was watching Sesame Street on my parents' TV. So,
30 years ago, I was not alive.
well, good for you.
According to many people. According to some, I might have been.
Yeah,
Depending who you are.
yeah. I think it depends on the point of view. If you're looking at it from the Jewish point of view, no, you were not alive yet.
Right.
So you were still a good 3.5 months from being alive.
Right. So, I am severely distracted by the conversation going on behind us about Henrietta Lacks.
Henrietta Lacks, the progenitor of which vaccine was she?
I think polio.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Jonas Salk used her DNA.
Yeah, from the
Or not even DNA. DNA hadn't been discovered yet, but her genetic material.
from her tumor
Yes.
at Johns Hopkins was harvested, which was a big ethical issue, where I used to live. Anyway, speaking of governmental interaction with religion, so
Yes.
these two parades are happening at the same time. We have this image of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem of being this truly a parade in the best sense of the word,
Right.
but I'm beginning to wonder if it was just kind of the crowd of the closest disciples doing their own thing. Maybe it wasn't, throngs and throngs of people.
It's entirely possible. I am sure that a significant number of people probably did follow Jesus around.
Right.
Because he was, he might have not have been a big deal politically. Rome probably couldn't have given a crap less about him until the priests started making noise.
Right.
And they were like, okay, we got to take care of this. But locally, he would have been a big deal, if only for the novelty.
Right. So the reason I'm wondering about this is because we find in this text the Pharisees saying, tell the disciples to stop this.
Right.
And so I wonder, they must have thought that their word would have carried weight. And I don't think that the Pharisees could have stopped something that was so big.
Right.
That the way we imagine, I'm imagining St. Patrick's Day in Savannah or Mardi Gras in New Orleans.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it was like that. And,
No.
and I don't think I want it to be like that.
No. And one thing that just occurred to me, as we're talking about this, if we're talking about the account from the book of Luke, which we are this week, because that is the see your passage for Palm Sunday. Earlier in the book of Luke, you have the sending out of the 70 disciples. And they're referred to there as disciples. Maybe that's the 70. Maybe the Pharisees are saying, your disciples. That would be a common term for any rabbi.
Right.
Your disciples.
Right.
So, and we know that even if the Pharisees didn't agree with Jesus, even if they didn't, even if they were afraid of what he was doing for political reasons, we know from other passages that a lot of them had a certain type and degree of respect for him.
Right.
So
a couple of weeks ago we had the go and tell that fox passage where there was actually a Pharisee looking out for Jesus and saying,
Herod's
by the
coming
way,
to kill you.
Herod's coming to kill you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, It's just a very interesting situation to look at, especially when you consider the way that event precipitated the interactions later in that week between Jesus and the government because of religious reasons.
One phrase that has continued to resonate with me for some reason more this year than I've ever experienced. Throughout the week, there are times when, the different powers that be want to exterminate Jesus,
right,
for lack of a better term. But they don't, because people are beginning to believe him.
Right.
And people are beginning to follow him. And they were afraid of what people might think.
Yeah.
How typical is that of our religious culture now?
I think
particularly with regard to, what we just talked about with the intersections of religion and politics.
Yeah. Because I'm not going to name names or name parties, because I think most of our listeners can figure this out for ourselves. But we have a certain political party led by a certain political leader whose members, even though they clearly find the things that this leader says to be distasteful or even un-American, refuse to outright condemn him because they're afraid of what the people will think. Now, that's a poor comparison. Please understand, I'm not comparing fake tan man to Jesus Christ.
Right.
But the idea of being afraid of political power and the people who have latched onto that power,
right,
I think is as applicable here as it was in the story of the Palms liturgy.
Right, right. So there's this, throughout this text, there's this interplay of power and vulnerability. That's very interesting. Yes, the powers that be that want to get rid of Jesus, but is kind of afraid of the following that he has. They have this power, and Jesus shows this vulnerability. Yet, his vulnerability that is so attractive to so many presents itself as power to the people in power, and that's why they're afraid of him. And so I think there's this really interesting interplay that if we look into our own kind of confrontations with power structures and power systems, whether they be structures in our own churches, power structures in, your field of leadership,
right,
in the government and in, military systems.
Well, you can say the Navy.
Okay.
Nobody's going to yell at me for that.
I wasn't sure. No. So when we confront power structures, I think the temptation is always to take the kind of power outlook of the government officials in this text. But it's Jesus' power that is most moving, most attractive, most subversive.
I think it's not just his power, it is his speaking of truth to power.
Yeah.
And a sidebar on that, since you mentioned the Navy. So, a few months ago when I went to D.C. for the whole interview, the panel that you sit in front of is made up of all senior officers, mostly captains. The reasoning for that is that it doesn't matter how inexperienced or new you are as a minister, you have to be able to go and speak truth to power, no matter how senior it is. And they want you to demonstrate that in that room, that you are not afraid to speak truth to that table of power. And I think that's the kind of... I was going somewhere with that. I think that's the kind of power that we see Jesus' own power trying to confront here. He is attempting to speak truth to power, and I think that is a big part of what people found attractive about it.
Right.
Because they're afraid to. He's not.
Right. Yeah. So So my question is, what does this look like today? This Palm Sunday procession where this rogue rabbi is leading a group of dissenters into the city to celebrate a religious holiday where it is highly regulated by government officials. What is going on like this today?
I think that looks like Moral Mondays, or the March for Our Lives, or the Women's March, or a Pride Parade. You know, because Pride Parades have always been a form of protest against power.
Yeah.
And yes, LGBT persons have far more rights now than they did when Stonewall happened 50 years ago. But they still have to push back against systems that are out to oppress them. And so you have the Pride Parade being, in a manner of speaking, it is analogous to the entrance of Christ into Jerusalem.
There's an element of protest and an element of celebration.
Absolutely.
I like that. I hadn't thought about that. I asked that question without thinking of how I would answer it.
That's okay.
And I'm starting to wonder, in my own context as a pastor, in many ways we kind of see potential power confrontations and we run the other direction. And so I don't know that there is a confrontation I don't know that there has been in my recent ministry of, this type of oppositional power.
Sure.
But I wonder if there are churches that are, obviously we know that there are churches that are doing this, but what that looks like for your average church member. Our church members are going to be so happy to wave palm branches on Sunday morning.
Right.
But that's not what this is about.
Sure. I think what that looks like, so many moons ago, 7 years ago now almost, Katie, my wife, was a ministry intern at Green Street United Methodist Church here in Winston-Salem. And Green Street is a unique church.
Right.
They refuse to conform to the United Methodist Book of Discipline in many ways, and especially in light of the recent United Methodist General Conference. And they have consistently been pushing back against systems of oppression with regard to LGBT persons. And that congregation, it's not just Kelly Carpenter, the pastor of that church, doing the pushing. It is everybody in that church.
Right.
They are all actively involved. I think that is what ideally it would look like. What does it look like in reality? I think you look at, say, a church like the Riverside Church in New York.
Right.
Amy Butler is a great example.
Who is considered the Baptist Pope, I hear.
Yes, I have heard that as well. Yeah. I think she's a great example of somebody who is not afraid of standing up to power. But the question that I would have for the Riverside Church is how many people in that congregation are similarly involved.
Right.
Because that is an old congregation. Being a member there is a mark of status.
Right.
So I think probably for a lot of those people, they may not agree with what Amy Butler does. She's their senior pastor, and she has enough support that she can do the work that she does. But how many people in that congregation would actively do it with her? Well,
which brings up, I think, a bigger point, which I don't know who your listeners are, but
mostly Wake Div alumni.
Right. So here's a problem that I had when I came out of Wake Div. I came out of Wake Div thinking that the world was like Wake Div. And I know a lot of Wake Div alums who thought that.
Yep.
And so my first church job, I went to rural Georgia.
Yeah.
Technically a metro of Atlanta, but closer to Alabama than Atlanta.
Right.
I went to rural Georgia and was trying to talk about religious liberty, at the same time that our ideas about religious liberty have been hijacked.
Right.
Pastoring to a largely, as an associate pastor, to a largely politically different congregation than myself, in a very purple, leaning red area.
Yes.
So what do we do you've got Marines who are going to be young Marines who are probably going to vote differently than you. What do
Absolutely.
you do? How do you confront the powers that be while also not running them off
That's going to be a real challenge.
and not losing your job?
Well, see, here's the thing. I won't lose my job for preaching my conscience because that's required of me by federal law to
That's
do
nice
worship.
because it's not required of me by federal law.
Yeah, I am required by Title 10 of the U.S. Code to conduct religious services in the manner of my own tradition. That's literally what it says in the U.S. Code.
Right.
And my tradition, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, says you will preach your conscience within the bounds of the gospel. So that is what I will do. And, I also served a rural church right out of Wake Div. In my case, in Northwest Missouri. I was a little older than a lot of the people in your class. I was 7 years older, obviously.
Right.
And I had been in the world, if you will.
But not of it, right?
That's right. Prior to going to Wake Div. So I knew the bullshit.
Right.
And I had that in my mind when I went to Gower Christian Church. And I knew what I had to do to put this idea of religious liberty in terms that a much more conservative congregation would understand and accept. And by and large, they did. I cannot stress enough when I talk to people, it was a small contingent of malcontents with a lot of money that were responsible
and that's
for
how it
me
always
being terminated by that church. Also, side note, I look with no small amount of satisfaction on the Facebook feeds of some of the kids who were in my youth group there, who are now in college, and see how liberal AF they have become, and it fills me with glee. But
That's
anyway,
what happens.
So, we all, I think, yes, a lot of people come out of Wake Div and expect to be able to preach to congregations that they serve the same way they did standing in the pulpit in Davis Chapel.
Right.
And they are in for a rude awakening.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think the answer that I'm coming to about this is that Jesus brings people along.
Yeah.
He invites the disciples. Invites is probably a very low-key word. He tells the disciples to go be a part of this. Go get the colt.
Yep.
And I think the way that he brings people along is compelling.
Yeah.
He doesn't alienate them.
Right.
Which is hard.
We now have background music. Bare naked ladies playing in the background.
That was awesome.
I'm looking at the audio feed on my computer. I'm not sure that's even being picked up, but
that's too bad.
yeah. I'll use it as the bumpers.
There you go.
So
anyway, I am taken aback by how Jesus is able to bring people along,
Sure.
throughout the journey, and that seems to me. I know that Melissa tonight talked about how we need to have more grace for each other because we don't know all the words and we don't know. Sometimes we aren't studying up on the latest queer theory or whatever it may be. So it may sound initially like I'm kind of copping out with this whole being interested in the way that Jesus brings people along, but
Sure.
I do think that that's a compelling way for us to put the spirit of this day into action today.
I agree. Because, yeah, it's definitely picking it up.
Yeah.
Also, the song 1 Week, think about it. 1 week, very appropriate for Holy Week, right?
It is.
But Jesus, it was not in his nature to force people to do anything.
Right.
And when we start trying to force people to do something, whether it's agree with our ideas or be part of a church, that's when we're going to lose them. And that's a lesson that a lot of the church has yet to learn.
Right.
And we can't force that on the church. I mean,
right.
That would completely defeat the purpose.
Which is because it was forced upon people for so long. That was just a sidebar. There are no scars that I'm speaking out of. Those are, that is purely objective.
No,
Sunday school doesn't work anymore.
It really doesn't. But, you know.
There might be a little scar there.
But then we have to, we can't just say this is not working anymore. We have to say what will work.
Right.
How do we invite people to come along?
Right. Which, you know, you were talking about Jesus not compelling people to do anything. Mm-hmm. At the end of this scripture, when the Pharisees say, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." Jesus doesn't even tell them to stop.
Right. And
Jesus won't tell them to stop.
Yeah.
And so there is this, like, Jesus is not going to compel us to do something and also to stop something, which I think is a very interesting approach.
Yeah.
Because there are so many times when I'm walking through my church and, like, see people do something, I'm like, I want to shake you and say, you should not do that.
It's like that frustrated preacher video.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
The song that just came on.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, I think you're talking about that piece at the end of the passage. Even more than that, Jesus is like, even if I did tell them to shut up, I could not silence them.
Right. There's something about the fire within us that never can be silent, which I did learn that at Wake Div. There are some things that I just cannot be quiet about. And
there are some things that you should not be quiet about.
Exactly.
And I think...
Or the rocks would cry out.
That's right. And I think religious liberty is definitely one of those things.
Right.
Because when we become silent about our religious liberty, that's the day that we become collaborators.
Right. So how do you... and this is a question I wanted to ask Melissa tonight, but I was too scared to speak up in the crowd.
You weren't scared, you were a tired introvert.
Yes, I'm an exhausted introvert. So how do you claim religious liberty in a day where religious liberty does not mean what you say, what religious liberty, if it's said in the news or in, you know, whatever, largely does not mean what you perceive it to mean? What do you do about the disconnect there? Chaplain gone.
I think you do the best that you can. You know, a question I get all the time is how do you handle being a minister in a service and the Navy is always the one that gets this crap put on them? Never the Army, never the Air Force. It's the Navy that always gets this crap put on us about how we're not allowed to pray in Jesus' name, which is simply untrue.
Oh, all those Liberty chaplains do it all the time.
Well, and it's not just that. It's the fact that the Secretary of the Navy instruction says when you are praying at a public service, it is to be a non-sectarian prayer. Right. You may pray to God. That same Secretary of the Navy instruction says that no chaplain will ever be compelled to do such a prayer. So you have these people who have completely misinterpreted the Secretary of the Navy instruction, probably a lot of them willfully for their own political gain, who are crying about religious liberty being compromised by the U.S. Navy, when in reality, the United States Navy has taken more steps to protect the religious liberty of sailors and Marines than the Army and the Air Force have. I can tell you that for damn sure.
Right. Well, it's like what Melissa was talking about tonight. When she was talking about when presidents in history have spoken about religion, the goal is to speak in a way that uplifts everyone's religious liberty, rather than speaking in a way that says, well, we've got kind of Class A religious citizens and then Class B, C, D.
Right.
And that's something that many of our past presidents have gotten right really well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people like to marginalize Thomas Jefferson's commentary about the hedge of separation between church and state. They're like, oh, that wasn't in any government document. It was just in a letter he wrote to a Baptist association, which is true.
Right.
But that is found throughout his doctrinal work within the writings of the U.S. government. This idea that Jefferson, I can't honestly say that I think Jefferson respected all religion in the same way we would today, simply because the 18th century understanding of, say, Islam was a lot different in North America than we have of it today. But even then, he didn't speak of it particularly complimentary, Islam in particular, but he did say these people should nonetheless be free to practice their religion in the manner they see fit without government interference.
Right.
And, Jefferson was the architect of our government. Him and Alexander Hamilton, even though the two of them hated each other's guts. Hamilton was not particularly religious, so he really doesn't apply here. But Jefferson wrote the architecture of how we have maintained religious liberty in this country for 220 years.
Right.
And for that to be threatened by a group of small, scared men who don't want to see their power diminished, even though their power has been steadily diminished over the last 40 years, because they don't want to see equality and equity, because that means they don't possess all the power.
Right. Well, those same men have trouble with Jefferson because he cut up his Bible.
Yes, he did.
But seriously, when that's the major religious narrative of a person, that they did something to, in many ways, defame the way that other people perceive them. You might not think that what he did is necessarily bad, but that doesn't matter because history has dubbed him a heretic for cutting up his Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways, right?
Even though all he did was remove the supernatural element of the gospel.
He did what, the Jesus Seminar did.
Exactly. He did the same thing Marcus Borg did.
Right. Who has
Marcus
always
Borg
been
got decried as a heretic.
Who has also been called a heretic.
Yeah.
But he did what every single person that I know in ministry has done. He took out the texts that he had trouble with.
Yeah.
And he didn't preach on them. Or he didn't use those for his daily devotional material. I don't know that he had daily devotional material, but...
Well, and what Jefferson kept of the Gospels was the teachings of Christ, which, truth be told, if you claim the Christian faith, the teachings of Christ should be the most important part of those Gospels anyway. That's the instructions for how you are supposed to live your life.
Right.
So Jefferson kept the most important part.
Right. It goes back... That idea goes to what Gandhi, said was to E. Stanley Jones, a Methodist missionary to India. He said, E. Stanley Jones asked Gandhi what Christians could do better in India, how Christians could be better in India, and one of his responses was, get back to the heart of Christ's teachings.
Right.
And that is love God and love neighbor. And he said, for love is the center of Christianity.
Yeah.
And so many of us get off track with that.
Yeah. Which, it's remarkable to think that Gandhi, who was not a Christian, he was a Hindu pacifist, understood Christianity far better than most Christians of his day, most Christians today.
And highly revered Jesus to the point where... the Sermon on the Mount was one of his favorite pamphlets to carry around.
Yeah. But, that kind of... That's where you get into the speaking of truth to power, scaring people.
Right. Which, the way that Gandhi did it with the pacifism, I mean, all of that echoes what's going on in this text.
Yep.
With Jesus riding in on a donkey rather than, the great white horse, as they expected the Messiah to, be a war hero rather than this wandering rabbi, largely homeless, riding in on a donkey.
Yeah, riding in on a pack animal, a working pack animal.
Right.
And it's Gandhi protested that way for the same reason Jesus came into Jerusalem this way. How does a government push back against a peace? How do you push back against peace? You can't.
Right.
Use power to push back against peace because they do not mesh. They are not made of the same material. They do not exist in the same dimension.
Right.
To get a little sci-fi about it.
Yeah, there you go. The peace exists in the underworld. Right?
I think power might exist more in the underworld.
Yeah, that's probably true. I was trying to make a Stranger Things reference.
Yeah. The upside down is where you will find peace.
Yeah.
Along with the Demogorgon.
Right. Right. Man, there's good music now.
Well, it's all been Bare Naked Ladies for the last 15 minutes
been
or
good.
So we should probably wrap up because Footnote is closing in 10 minutes, and we've been recording for 40.
Yeah.
Which is a good length podcast, not the hour and a half extravaganzas we've been doing lately.
Which is probably better for everybody.
It's neater and more concise.
Yeah.
Of course, we didn't, spend 20-25 minutes talking about liquor tonight, so that probably helped.
Well, I can tell you about the properties of my water.
It's cold and wet.
Yes. It's got one oxygen molecule for every 2 hydrogen molecules.
That it does.
Yep. That's it.
So, any last thoughts on this passage?
I'm still taken by this idea of the way that power and vulnerability play together and against each other, but also the way that power influences vulnerability and vulnerability influences power.
Sure. Yeah. No, I like where you're coming with that. And, as somebody who has to be a practitioner of religion in the public square every day, that's my job.
Right.
I can't think of a better example to look to for it than a man coming in humility and peace.
Right.
To speak truth to power.
Right. So I want to raise this now, and then maybe during the Easter episode we can talk about it.
Okay.
I would be interested in tracing this vulnerability strand through Holy Week.
Okay.
Through Golgotha, through Holy Saturday, to Easter.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can do that.
And perhaps Easter might be the triumph of vulnerability.
I can already think of a way or two it could be, but we will save that for the next episode.
All right.
Which I believe will be, sadly, your last in person.
Right. I better get that great introduction that you had last time.
Oh, yes. Trust me, because Ted will be back for that one. So
yeah,
we'll bring back Eye in the Sky.
All right.
And the whole 9 yards. So, yeah, join us again in 2 weeks for our episode recapping Holy Week and Easter. And until then, have a drink, water or liquor, it doesn't matter, and read your Bible.
It's been 1 week since you looked at me, threw your arms in the air and said you're crazy. 5 days since you tackled me, I still got the red burns on both my knees. It's been 3 days since the afternoon, you realize it's not my fault, but I'm only too soon. Yesterday you've forgiven me, and now I'll sit back and wait till you say you're sorry.
Libations and Lectionaries is recorded and edited using Audacity open source audio editing software. 1 Week by the Bare Naked Ladies is used as reference for a point of commentary. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week when we celebrate Easter.
Chickadee China, the Chinese chicken. You have a drumstick and your brain stops sticking. Watching X-Files with no lights on, with all our masons. I hope the smoking man's in this one like Harrison Ford. I'm getting frantic, like Stingham Tantric, like Snickers guaranteed to satisfy. Like Kurosawa, I make mad films. Okay, I don't make films, but if I did, they'd have a samurai. Gonna get a set of better clubs, gonna find the kind with tiny.